The air was thick with anticipation, a storm brewing in the world of combat sports. But this was no ordinary storm. It was the kind that could shake the very foundations of boxing itself. A figure stood at the eye of it, a man who had already rewritten the rules of another sport, a man unafraid of controversy. Dana White, the relentless mastermind behind the UFC's global dominance, had just made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the industry. Alongside Saudi Arabia's Turki Al Sheikh, he was about to launch a new boxing league under the TKO banner. But what was more shocking wasn't the announcement itself, it was the message behind it. White didn't just want to start a league. He wanted to break boxing down, tear it apart, and rebuild it from the ground up. And that, right there, was where the war began. Some called him a visionary. Others saw him as an outsider, stepping into an arena he didn't understand. The reactions weren't just mixed, they were explosive. The traditionalists, those who had grown up immersed in the sweet science, saw it as an insult, a declaration of war against the very foundation of professional boxing. "Dana doesn't know us about boxing," one fan spat out in frustration. Another voiced what many feared: "The more he talks, the more I want him to stay away from my sport." But then, there were those who saw hope. Boxing had been plagued by politics, by mismatched fights, by champions who avoided each other for years. Maybe, just maybe, Dana White was the man who could force real change. Maybe he could make the best fight the best. But change comes with resistance. And Dana White had just entered one of the dirtiest, most cutthroat businesses in the world. If he thought he could waltz in and do what he did with the UFC, he was in for a rude awakening. Because in boxing, there were no single governing bodies, no central authority to dictate how things should be done. There were multiple promoters, each controlling their own roster of fighters, each unwilling to bend to another man's rules. Eddie Hearn, one of the sport's top promoters, issued a warning disguised as a friendly piece of advice. His voice was lighthearted, but the message was deadly serious. "Boxing is the worst business in the world," Hearn said with a laugh, but his words carried weight. "I hope these guys have the appetite to be up all of night and sleep with one eye open every single day." He wasn't joking. In this business, power shifted constantly. A single negotiation could flip the landscape overnight. You're not going to get control where you can go to bed at 10 o'clock and wake up at 8 o'clock and expect the industry and your situation to be exactly the same, he warned. That was the nature of the beast. And if Dana White thought he could tame it, he had another thing coming. There was another problem, one that many believed would be Dana White's downfall. The UFC was built on a single structure, a model where White had total control. Fighters signed under the UFC banner, and he dictated their fights. But boxing wasn't like that. The top fighters weren't locked into a single organization. They were free agents in a fragmented world. The idea of Dana White coming in and dictating matchups, getting the best to fight the best under his rules, many believed it was wishful thinking. Even Paulie Malignaggi, a former world champion turned commentator, tore into White's vision. "He's going solo," Malignaggi ranted. "He won't work with the other promoters, and that means the whole sport will suffer." It was a brutal assessment, but not an uncommon one. White had already hinted at his reluctance to play ball with the likes of Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, or Oscar De La Hoya. When asked if he planned to work with them, he simply smirked and said, "I don't know. We'll see." It was the kind of answer that sent alarm bells ringing across the sport. And yet, there was one undeniable truth. Dana White wasn't a man who backed down. He had built the UFC into a global juggernaut, and he had done it by going against the grain, by forcing change where others thought it was impossible. Maybe, just maybe, he could do the same in boxing. But if there was one thing certain, it was this: he wasn't going to be welcomed with open arms. He was stepping into a war zone, and every promoter, every fighter, and every old-school boxing purist would be watching, waiting for him to fail. But what if he didn't? What if, against all odds, Dana White actually found a way to break the system and rebuild it in his image? That was the question that had everyone on edge. Because love him or hate him, one thing was for sure: Dana White wasn't here to play by the old rules. He was here to change the game. And that was what scared boxing's power players the most. But fear wasn't an emotion Dana White was unfamiliar with. He had seen it before, first in the eyes of the doubters who swore the UFC would never rise beyond a fringe sport, then in the faces of his competitors as he turned it into a billion-dollar empire. Now he saw it again, lingering in the tense conversations of boxing's old guard. They masked it with scoffs and dismissive remarks, but the reality was clear. Boxing had been standing on shaky ground for years, plagued by corruption, mismatched fights, and promotional greed. And now, here came a man with a history of bulldozing through obstacles, claiming he was going to tear everything down and start over. No one knew exactly what his next move would be, but everyone knew one thing: Dana White was dangerous. The problem, however, was that boxing wasn't just about fighters. It was about power, about decades of relationships built between managers, promoters, sanctioning bodies, and television networks. It was about backroom deals that kept the biggest fights from happening, about contracts that locked fighters into ironclad agreements. To break boxing down, White would need to do more than just throw money at it. He would need to force change in a system that thrived on chaos. Turki Al-Sheikh, his Saudi Arabian business partner in this endeavor, had already made waves by bringing some of the biggest fights to the Middle East. He had money, influence, and a deep understanding of how to play the game. But Dana White had something else: an obsession with control. The UFC worked because he owned everything. He made the matchups. He set the rules. He controlled the narrative. But boxing wasn't built for that kind of structure, and that was what had so many insiders convinced that White's vision was doomed before it even started. Eddie Hearn's warning about sleeping with one eye open wasn't just a throwaway line. It was a statement about survival. Hearn had spent years maneuvering through the shark-infested waters of boxing. He knew what White was up against. The late-night calls, the secret negotiations, the fighters demanding more money, the television networks pulling strings behind the scenes. White might have dominated the world of MMA, but boxing was a different beast altogether. And then there was the question of whether he could actually land the fights that mattered. The dream scenario, the one that had fans buzzing, was Dana White managing to put together something boxing had failed to deliver: the absolute best versus the best. Fighters like Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford headlining his first event. It was the kind of announcement that would shake the world. But was it realistic? White had been cagey about it, neither confirming nor denying whether such matchups were in the works. "Listen, my model is way different," he said, sidestepping the question. "Turkey has things that he's obligated to over the next 18 months. I want to break this sport down and build it from the ground up like we did with the UFC, so I'm on a different path." It was an answer that raised more questions than it answered. What was his model? What was his path? And more importantly, how did he expect to convince the world's best fighters who already made millions under existing promoters to take a gamble on his vision? The skepticism wasn't just coming from fans or rival promoters. Even those inside the sport questioned whether White truly understood what he was getting himself into. Paulie Malignaggi, never one to hold back, ripped into White's approach. "Dana's going solo," he argued. "He won't work with the other promoters, and that means the whole sport will suffer." And that was the real battle Dana White faced. Not just convincing fans, but convincing the fighters, the managers, the power brokers who had built their fortunes in a system that thrived on fragmentation. Because at the end of the day, boxing's biggest problem had never been a lack of talent. It had been the people in control. So, what would happen next? Would Dana White crash and burn? Another outsider swallowed up by boxing's endless maze of politics and greed? Or would he find a way to do the impossible, to pull off what so many had failed to accomplish before him? One thing was certain, the fight had already begun. Not in the ring, but behind closed doors, in whispered meetings, intense negotiations that would decide whether TKO boxing would rise or fall before it even began. The industry was watching. The fighters were waiting. The old guard was sharpening their knives. And Dana White? He was smiling because he knew something they didn't. He had been here before, and he had never lost a fight that mattered.